Good morning to everyone. My name is Simos Zenios, and I am the Associate Director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. It is a great joy to welcome you, familiar and new faces today from around the globe, to the book presentation and discussion of James Barron's The Greek Connection, the life of Elias Demetracopoulos and the untold story of Watergate. Our center organizes events on Greek books and books of broader Greek interest regularly. But today's event is one of great interest and particularly special. It is special first because it gives us the opportunity to collaborate and to co-sponsor it with the American Hellenic Council. I have the pleasure of co-moderating this discussion with Christiana Contu, the Executive Director of the American Hellenic Council. It is a great joy to partner with such a leading organization in the community, and we look forward to other such opportunities in the future. Christiana, would you like to say a few words as well?
Good morning to everybody in Los Angeles. Thank you, Simos, and thank you to the entire UCLA SNF Hellenic Center team, especially Dr. Sharon Gerstel. On behalf of the American Hellenic Council, I would like to welcome you all to this very important book presentation. Thank you to Governor Dukakis, and welcome to Consul General Evgenia Beniatoglou. And of course, thank you to Mr. Barron for this important work. We're very excited to hear more about the life of Elias Demetracopoulos. Thank you.
A leading figure in American politics and Greek American life, Dukakis was born in Brookline, Massachusetts. He graduated from Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, and he began his political career as a Massachusetts legislator. He went on to serve 3 terms as the governor of Massachusetts, and he was the Democratic Party candidate for the presidency of the United States in 1988. Since 1991, Dukakis has been a distinguished professor of political science at Northeastern University and a visiting professor at the School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Our center is honored to have Governor Dukakis serve as a member of our faculty advisory committee. Governor Dukakis, the floor is yours.
Simos, thank you very, very much. This is a little awkward because I'm standing in order to speak to you and stay in the frame here. So you're in luck. It won't be a long address, believe me. And in any event, the featured speaker today and the person that we're here to listen to is Jim Barron, who with his lovely wife has been a friend for many, many years here in the Boston area, and really has done a remarkable job on this book. I confess, and I say this as somebody who is strongly interested, obviously, and has been all his life in Greek-American relations and what is going on in Greece and its relationship with us here in the US, that I had not much understanding of the subject of the book, and in particular, Elias and his role both in Greek politics and here in the United States. But I found it fascinating. And it's a story that should be told, must be told, and that I'm not sure we told it well at the time it was happening. Now, I think many of you know that Greece has gone through an interesting period in what we can call modern history. Going back, and I remember this as a kid, to the Metaxas dictatorship in the 30s, the fact that until we came very close to World War II, it wasn't entirely clear what side Greece was going to be on under that dictator. What happened to Greece during the Nazi occupation, that I remember quite well because we had relatives who suffered under that occupation in many, many ways. And I remember the stories coming back about what was happening to our relatives during that period. But this particular story about Elias is one that really needs telling, deserves telling, and really hasn't gotten the kind of exposure that it needs and should have until Jim decided to write this book. And it's a fascinating tale, which I think many Greek Americans, including myself, who consider ourselves reasonably well informed about what has been going on in terms of Greece's relationship with the United States, and so on, that I'm not sure we were particularly well informed at the time. I do remember some things about what was happening during the period covered by the book. The coup of the colonels. I remember, Jim, the fact that I was visited on more than one occasion by Greek Americans asking me to pipe down and not to be critical of the junta. And I remember saying to them, wait a second, don't we all believe in democracy? I mean, what's going on here? Why are you coming to me and asking me to at least quiet down, if not support a military dictatorship? And those were quite vivid memories, are quite vivid memories that I have. But the story that your book tells about Elias, about a fellow named Tom Pappas, who my family knew quite well, and about what was going on during that period is one that really hasn't been told at all, or not told very well. And this book tells it brilliantly. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us who are Greek Americans, as well as those who are not, that Jim Barron has done a really remarkable public service. And how he did this and how he pulled together the various strands that are reflected in the book is itself a story. But my hat's off to you, Jim. Thank you so much. And I hope we can get lots and lots of people to read this book. It deserves reading and thinking and reflecting on what was going on at the time and on Elias's role in that period. In any event, thanks so much for doing it. It's a pleasure to be part of this. And I urge all of you, not just to read it, but to make sure others do as well. There is enormous richness here in the book and in the research that Jim did. And I think you'll see that as you read the book. In any event, hats off, Jim, to you and to your lovely wife, who I've known for years as well. And thank you for doing a remarkable job on this book.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis, for those opening remarks. So before Mr. Barron starts his book presentation, I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. James Barron is a journalist, attorney, and founding board member of the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. He has taught courses at MIT, led study groups at Harvard's Institute of Politics, and lectured at universities in Paris and Tokyo. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Barron received his A.B. degree with honors from the University of California at Berkeley. He also received advanced degrees in political science, communications, and law, covering national and international politics for various news media. His articles appeared in such publications as the Boston Phoenix, the Christian Science Monitor, the Boston Globe, Newsday, the New Republic, and the European. So welcome, Mr. Barron. Please tell us about your book.
Thank you, Simos and Christiana. I greatly appreciate the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture for inviting me to talk to you today. Thanks also to the American Hellenic Council for co-sponsoring this event. And thank you, Governor Dukakis, for your kind words. As someone from your hometown who's known you since your younger days in the Massachusetts legislature, I've admired you for over 50 years. You're a role model for all who aspire to a life of public service at the highest level. To all of you joining us by Zoom from Los Angeles to Athens, I look forward to your questions and a lively discussion. But before beginning, joining you from wintry Boston, where it's been 7 degrees Fahrenheit this week, I must admit to a touch of jealousy, given temperature where you are, even in Athens. So let's proceed. The Greek connection, The Life of Elias Demetracopoulos and the Untold Story of Watergate, was released last summer. After more than a decade of research and writing, a long gestation, and in a pandemic, a difficult delivery. It's a nonfiction political thriller, a story of international intrigue, audacious courage, relentless battles, determined survival, and heroism against enormous odds. For those of you who know Greek culture, it's also about that undefinable word philotimo, literally friend of honor, but it means so much more. The book involves abuses of power at the highest levels in two countries, foreign interference in elections, dark money, vicious disinformation campaigns and intimidation of journalists. And it's not even about Donald Trump, although there are implications for our recent history. The hero of the story is Elias Demetracopoulos. Not exactly a household name, but for 3 decades in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, he was known in Washington and in major European capitals simply as Elias. And he's worth remembering. Elias Demetracopoulos was a living definition of multidimensional: teenage resistance fighter, tortured prisoner, Civil War casualty, controversial journalist, information broker, lobbyist, financial consultant, trusted advisor, ladies' man, tipster, troublemaker, dangerous gadfly, suspected foreign agent, desired extra man for Georgetown dinner parties, impassioned democracy fighter, and free press advocate. He had many friends and many enemies and sources that span the political spectrum. Elias always cultivated an air of mystery and carefully compartmentalized the different parts of his life. When he died in 2016, obituaries in both the New York Times and the Washington Post described him as enigmatic. He was said to have negotiated a unique and controversial swath through Washington's political and social thickets. Ironically, for all his life's achievements, he is perhaps most famous for what he tried to do and failed. Foreign meddling in American elections didn't start in 2016 with the Russians and Donald Trump. George Washington, in his valedictory speech as president, warned his countrymen against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. Thomas Jefferson didn't heed Washington's warning and lost his first race for the presidency. For more than a century and a half afterwards, even though there were various foreign attempts to influence American elections, none had succeeded. People appeared to take seriously a fundamental principle of our representative democracy, that the outcome of American elections should reflect the preferences of the American electorate and not the special interests of foreign powers. This changed dramatically in 1968. The man with Richard Nixon is Tom Pappas, a Greek-American industrial tycoon and Nixon fundraising powerhouse. In 1968, he convinced the Greek military junta, which had overthrown his country's democratic government the year before, to buy influence with the Nixon campaign. Pappas made the case that a Nixon-Agnew administration would be more supportive of their dictatorship than would a Democratic administration. So the junta secretly funneled $549,000, almost $4 million in today's dollars, to Nixon campaign officials. Over the next 6 years, Nixon administration policies toward Greece would repeatedly demonstrate it was money well spent. Remember how close the 1968 race was? Remember how uncertain its outcome? Support was soft for all 3 candidates, Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, and George Wallace. As late as mid-October, 29% of voters said they were not certain they would end up voting for their preferred choice. This lack of enthusiasm meant a higher than usual possibility of last-minute switches if there were a late campaign disclosure. That election was the second closest presidential contest in the 20th century. The margin of victory was less than 1%. A shift of fewer than 42,000 votes in only 3 states, far fewer than Trump needed for his minuscule margin in 2016. would have thrown the outcome into the House of Representatives, which the Democrats controlled. It's worth remembering that Pappas, the pitchman and the bagman for the illegal funds, later became known on the Watergate tapes as the Greek bearing gifts, celebrated in Republican circles because he did business using untraceable cash. Earlier in the 1968 campaign, Elias had gotten a promise from Nixon's running mate, Spiro Agnew, that Agnew would remain neutral on the issue of the Greek military junta. But in September, Agnew, in a speech to the National Press Club, did a 180. Elias, sitting at the head table, was stunned at the betrayal. Using his network of sources, Elias discovered the reason behind the Agnew switch. Tom Pappas had convinced the Greek CIA to fund the Nixon campaign. Interestingly, this money likely originated as US taxpayer dollars provided to Greece as US aid from the Pentagon's black budget. Elias gave the information to Larry O'Brien, Hubert Humphrey's campaign manager in 1968. But for a variety of reasons I go into in the book, O'Brien didn't use the surprise information and Nixon was elected. David Broder, the former dean of the Washington Press Corps, told me that no one knew the story at the time. But he said, if Elias's story had come out, it would have stopped reporters from the lazy narrative that there was a so-called new Nixon. That alone could have changed the outcome of such a razor-close election. Broder also said that the Greek money bombshell could have led to the contemporaneous public disclosure of the secret sabotage of the Paris peace talks. The Nixon people knew fragments about Elias's 1968 disclosure to O'Brien, and for years it caused them great anxiety. In 1971, Elias testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee against the Greek dictatorship and against Pappas. In that hearing, he hinted that he would disclose more about the 1968 money. So Pappas and his allies tried different approaches to get both the Greek and American governments to destroy Elias. Pappas menacingly threatened him directly. In early 1972, Attorney General John Mitchell publicly threatened and actually tried to have him deported, which at that time could have led to Elias's torture and death. The evidence Elias gathered and presented in 1968 was still in O'Brien's files in June 1972 and was part of what the burglars were looking for in the Watergate break-in. Ironically, when the Watergate scandal broke, Republicans actually asked Elias for his help. They wanted him to provide information about Kennedy administration break-ins, which Elias had experienced, that could have demonstrated similar behavior. He refused to do so. Timely disclosure of the 1968 illegal money transfer could have meant a Hubert Humphrey victory, meaning no President Nixon, no Watergate, and a different course of history. Imagine the possibilities if that counterfactual event, Richard Nixon's losing the 1968 presidential election, had actually taken place. At a 2009 fundraiser for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, of which I was a founding board member, I told our guest speaker, legendary journalist Cy Hirsch, that I was considering writing a magazine article about Tom Pappas and this unexplored, potentially explosive bombshell. He recommended that instead of focusing on Pappas the bagman, I focus on Greek journalist Elias Demetracopoulos, the person who unsuccessfully tried to expose the money laundering plot. After I flew to Washington to meet Demetracopoulos, I quickly realized that this episode was just a small part of Elias's much larger and even more riveting life story. It was a saga I knew I had to tell. It was a daunting task because I first needed to teach myself modern Greek history. And for most Americans, Greek history jumps from Pericles and Alexander the Great to Never on Sunday and Zorba the Greek. For the historians here, my book begins with a brief exploration of the tangled web of modern Greek history, alternating dictatorships and fragile democracies, monarchies and republics. Elias's father left Greece as a young man to seek his fortune in America in Chicago, but returned home to protect his fatherland in World War I. Elias was born in 1928. He was a precocious child, and at the outset of World War II, when he was just 12, he joined a small Athens resistance group to fight the German occupiers. He engaged in intelligence gathering and learned quickly how to interview people and separate actionable intelligence from false news. Intrepidly, he hid guns in his home and engaged in sabotage. But at 14 years old, he was captured, brutally tortured by the Nazis, sentenced to death, and imprisoned. He was spared from execution in December 1943 by the timely intervention of Archbishop Damaskinos, who managed to get Elias moved to a horrific but life-saving insane asylum for the last year of the war. After the short-lived liberation, Elias got shot by the communists during the dramatic events of December 1944. Later, he nearly died of tuberculosis. During his recovery, Elias voraciously followed the news and imagined becoming a journalist. He was particularly inspired by the career of CBS correspondent George Polk, and Elias obsessed about Polk's 1948 assassination. Still, journalism was the only career he ever seriously considered. When the Civil War was over, Elias was hired by Kathimerini, considered by many Greeks to be the leading Greek newspaper. His job was to cover the growing American presence in Greece. But he didn't want to be an ordinary reporter. He wanted to be an investigative journalist. From the beginning, he wanted to break stories that no one else had. Elias would never simply accept press releases and rewrite them as gathered news. He cultivated his sources across the political spectrum and ran with stories that often made his subjects squirm. During the 1950s and 60s, he became a controversial and fiercely independent, scoop-hungry reporter, exposing truths others wanted hidden. In 1963, his published interview with Senator Barry Goldwater was one of two Elias stories that influenced the outcome of that important Greek election. It's not surprising that both the Greeks and Americans labeled him persona non grata and tried to restrict his reporting. On his first trip to Washington, the CIA tried to recruit him as an asset. He turned them down. They tried again later, and he refused. Elias would pay a heavy price. His aggressive reporting and incorruptibility made him a thorn in the side of the intelligence community. The FBI began monitoring his activities in the US, including wedding to an American woman, even watching their wedding night hotel room. For years, intelligence agencies tapped his phones, followed him, and conducted break-ins where he lived. Both the CIA and KYP, the Greek counterpart, weaponized rumors and lies against him. They denied the legitimacy of his World War II awards for heroism and alleged he was really a communist in the pay of assorted Soviet bloc governments. The intelligence community's mendacity and political pressure cost him several jobs. One by one, some of the most prestigious American publications, which had hired him as a correspondent, fired him in the face of CIA pressure and explicit directions. The secret files of him grew and grew, and the lies followed him for decades. Whenever Elias wrote a story or made a statement that the Greek or American officials didn't like, they'd recirculate misleading and deceitful reports. But they couldn't stop his independent reporting in two major Greek dailies and a smaller one published in English. When the dictatorship took power in Greece in April 1967, it made mass arrests of its opponents. Elias went into hiding for weeks. When he surfaced, he didn't hide his opposition to the regime. But with severe press censorship, he knew he couldn't continue to work in Greece. His goal was to oppose the dictatorship from the United States. With the help of friends at the United Nations, he hatched an escape plan worthy of a John le Carré novel. At first, at the behest of the Greek colonels, the United States blocked his entry, but he did get in. For nearly 7 years, from the Fairfax Hotel and its Jockey Club restaurant his base of operations in Washington, he fought to restore democracy in his homeland. It was a struggle because both Democratic and Republican administrations supported the Greek military dictatorship as part of their Cold War policy. In the process, our government turned a blind eye to grotesque human rights and free press abuses and the rape of democracy in the land of its birth. Elias worked incessantly to push public opinion against the junta and get Congress to cut off funds and military weaponry to the dictators. He slept only 4 hours a night. He testified in congressional hearings. He ghost wrote speeches for members of Congress. He wrote articles, issued press releases, held press conferences, debated junta supporters on television and radio and in universities and in other forums. He raised funds for torture victims and told their stories. Here he is after the junta fell with the most famous torture victim, Spiros Moustaklis. Elias fought to keep Greece in the headlines long after it was no longer news in the United States. He became the leading force behind many pro-democracy editorials, news columns in America, and was an anonymous source from some European media. In doing so, Elias became a target of repeated Greek plots to kidnap and execute him, as well as continuing CIA, FBI, and State Department attacks on his reputation and his effectiveness. Unbroken, he resolutely stood up for himself, his country, and his sense of honor. In December 1970, Elias's father was dying in Greece. Though the Greek government had stripped him of his citizenship, Elias was determined to go back. To see his father one last time, he was in his apartment packing a suitcase when he got a call from Senator Ted Kennedy, who had some chilling information. Kennedy apologized for calling him so early in the morning, but told him, "Elias, I know you want to see your father, but I fear that if you go, you won't come back." Elias asked, "Are you telling me, Senator, that there's a plot, that my life is in danger?" In dire tones, Kennedy just urged him again not to go. Elias didn't go, and he didn't make it to his father's funeral, where there were as many police and armed soldiers looking for him as there were mourners. Afterward, it became apparent that Henry Kissinger and others in the Nixon administration had known about the threats to Elias and looked the other way. Having switched from journalist to activist, Elias played a variety of roles. From London and Paris to Brussels, Zurich, and Rome, and back to Washington, Elias traveled widely outside of Greece, meeting with a variety of resistance figures, such as, from left to right, Konstantinos Karamanlis, Andreas Papandreou, George Mavros, Melina Mercouri and Jules Dassin, Eleni Vlachou, and King Constantine. He personally lobbied European and NATO officials to press the dictatorship to restore democracy in Greece. Elias Demetracopoulos was a prime point of contact for Greek Navy leaders of the Velos Mutiny and for demonstrators who survived the Polytechnic uprising. Later, Elias tried to get the United States to intervene to stop the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And after the fall of the dictatorship, he flew to Geneva and London, New York, and then back to Washington to help Archbishop Makarios and Greek negotiators. After the restoration of Greek democracy, Elias decided to use the Freedom of Information Act to uncover the facts about American attacks on him. With the help of a good lawyer and friends in Congress, he sued the United States government, suing the FBI, the CIA, and State Department to vindicate his reputation. Secret documents in Greece and the United States now reveal the extent of efforts made to silence him. His battle took 8 years, but eventually he won. In 2008, a new Greek government bestowed on Elias the high honor of Commander of the Order of the Phoenix for his constant fight to preserve democracy, a recognition that pleased him greatly. Today, we sometimes despair that individuals can't influence the course of major events. We often look in vain for heroes who will stand up to abuses of power. Eventually, because of his courage and dogged determination, Elias not only made a difference, had an impact on his world, but in the end, successfully fought to clear his name. With the help of people like former CIA and FBI Director William Webster, shown here at Elias's award ceremony, Elias won exoneration from those who had malevolently disparaged him in the highest circles of power. You know, it's true that one courageous individual against all odds can make a difference. But being brave and principled can entail great sacrifice and profound personal risks to career, to family, and even to life itself. At Elias's funeral in 2016, Apostolos Kaklamanis, the longest serving president of Greece in modern times, made some impromptu remarks, pointing to Elias's life as an inspiration, not only for young journalists who never knew him, but for citizens everywhere. I would suggest that Elias Demetracopoulos is a model, not just for today's whistleblowers, but for anyone else determined that, regardless of the difficulty, the truth must prevail.
Thank you very much, James, for this wonderful presentation, this very fascinating presentation about a book that I'm sure will be of great interest to many of us here today and the community. For that reason, I'm going to provide the link in the chat for the website of the book, which also, besides the reviews, besides the excerpts, besides much more additional information, it also provides links where you can purchase the book. So you can find the link in the chat. We will now proceed to the Q&A. I would like to remind you that you can ask questions either by raising your hand using the raise the hand function of Zoom, which you can find under the icon reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can simply type your question in the chat, and Christiana and I will relay to the author. While we are waiting for questions to arrive, while we are waiting for your comments, James, can I ask you? You said that this was a work that took quite some time to finish, to complete. What were the challenges? Why did you need so much time? How did you address the issues that you faced in researching and writing?
Well, Elias Demetracopoulos was a very difficult subject. Several other authors had tried at different times to write a story, but had given up. And he didn't warm to my idea of writing a book about him until he had talked to me face to face over several months of my trips from Boston to Washington. And while he would give me information from his newspaper clippings and material about his public life, it was clear he didn't want to talk about his private life or his emotions. I also had conditions. I explained to him that I'd be writing a biography, not a hagiography. And while I sought his cooperation, it wouldn't be an as told to book. I said I was going to do my own independent research and that he had no editorial control over anything I wrote. He agreed, but he stubbornly kept trying to control my narrative. He gave me full power under the Freedom of Information Act to stand in his shoes, to basically, as if he were applying for the CIA and FBI and State Department documents, that to get things that he could get and to waive his privacy rights to restrict the dissemination of the information. But that took a period of years to get responses. And in many cases, what came back were heavily redacted documents and had to go through mandatory appeals for people, to see if they would open up some of the material that was redacted or fully withheld. And that went up over slowly. He himself opened up only slowly about his multifaceted personal life. And it was difficult. One of the things that was most exasperating is that he didn't want to divulge the names of his sources that he had promised confidentiality to, even long after the sources were dead. And it wasn't until I went to Greece in 2012 and came up with stories of his childhood, about his girlfriends and other things. And he'd say, "Where did you get those stories?" And I say, "I can't divulge my sources." He smiled, and we reached an accommodation where I said, I didn't have to put everything I learned in the book, but whatever went into the book had to be as accurate as possible. And that I said, would I be wrong if I said X? And if I gave the person's name, he would say, no, you wouldn't be wrong. That's how I would end up confirming the sources. And over a period of years, trust grew, and he ended up giving me papers, his personal papers, gave me diaries, gave me his calendars. And I was talking to him frequently, as often as daily, and then making frequent trips to Washington as I try to peel back the layers of his story, getting him to confirm and disconfirm information. And then later, as his Parkinson's got more difficult, his mind was working, but he had difficulty speaking. So frequently I had to devise other devices to interact with him to get him to respond and give him different scenarios. Is it A or B? And do that, and that took time. At the same time, my editors, when I kept telling him what I was discovering, was taking what was originally a small Watergate book into his full biography. And they said, "This is great, write more, write more." And so I did. Problem is that when he died after he died in 2016, I turned to writing the book full time. And in 2017, I turned in a manuscript that was over 850 pages. And my editor said to me, "Looks good, but we can't market a book of that length in today's world. Since the time I signed my contract, the average length of a nonfiction bestseller had dropped from 467 pages to 273 pages. So I was told I had to cut the book nearly in half. And I spent another 2 years basically taking 42 chapters and putting it into 29 chapters. And there's another aspect that probably goes to my fault, and that is most books of this sort are written either for American English authors or Greek authors from a particular political point of view. I tried to look at all sides as best I could, and also look at German sources, French sources, Australian sources, Polish sources, Italian sources as well. And so that added to the time.
Thank you very much, James. Christiana, I believe you have a question.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Barron, for that all-encompassing presentation. As a poli-sci nerd, I have so many questions from the Watergate implications to Tom Pappas. But I think prior to getting to those details, I want to ask, you mentioned Philotimo very often in connection to the Greek connection and to Elias Demetracopoulos. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on how you connect Philotimo, which is such an important part of our culture, in his story?
Well, it's interesting I asked that question because one of the original titles I suggested to my editor was to call the book Philotimo. As you all know far better than I, Philotimo goes to the moral majesty of Greek character. One definition that I remember being given was a highly developed sense of right and wrong involving personal pride and honor and obligation to the family community. And that really was a leitmotif that ran through the book. Elias's father instilled in him the unwavering importance of truth, integrity, and honor, and explained that Philotimo was an all-encompassing way of life. And one of the messages was that he had a duty to do good, even in great personal sacrifice. But as many of you know, there are many nuanced shades to that term. Elias's mother defined it differently. She said it was doing the right thing modestly when no one's watching you. Elias only got part of that. He had a big ego, and when I once asked him what he considered to be the most overrated of all the virtues, without hesitating, he said modesty. But at the same time, I remember discovering in his papers and in doing my research, Kostas Loukopoulos was tremendously important for me, helping to read, especially the handwritten Greek documents that I had to go through. And what I discovered in one of his papers was a letter from the Navy commander, Nikos Pappas, who was head of the Velos mutiny. And it was a letter to Elias thanking him, providing more support to the mutineers and their families than all the other Greeks living abroad. Elias never told me about this during his lifetime, and I've never found anybody else that he told. And there are other stories similar to that. When Elias was vindicated after his 8-year battle to clear his name, Elias told a reporter it was more than just a matter of honor. I think the line was, he said, they thought because I had a long Greek name that I wouldn't fight back, but I did. part of the message came through in the book and it becomes a part of Philotimo, was he remembered the pledge he made to himself as a scared 14-year-old when he was in a Verov prison after having been tortured and sentenced to death, in which he promised himself that if he ever got out alive, he would never let anyone bully him again.
James, can I ask you, you've written a book that has many audiences. I'm sure people interested in American politics, Greek Americans, people in Greece will be eager to read the book. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the reception that your book has had so far in this, from these different audiences, and how do you envision the reception going forward? What discussions do you think your book will give rise to? And if I may add a second part to this question, I'm now relaying a question sent from the Consul General Evgenia Beniadoglu. Do you see any connection between the conflicts described in the book, the battle for democracy described in the book, with current events?
There's a lot to unpack in those questions. Let me answer some, and I'll be able to answer other questions after it. Yes, there are a host of messages from then to today. I mean, clearly, one message is the foreign meddling in American presidential elections didn't begin in 2016 and continues. And this is true also in European countries as well. And something to be, those of us who care about democracy, should be very sensitive to. I think another message is that the claims of fake news are not new. That independent news media in every generation has to have that fight. Another aspect is that history, as Ken Burns said, is malleable, that our notion of what history is changes over time as we get more information. You were asking about different reactions. One reaction that's been interesting came from Governor Dukakis when he called me after he finished the book, and he was praising the book, and he said, this should be made into a movie. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, when she read a manuscript, said that this would make a great, terrific TV miniseries. And others, some mentioning the 200th anniversary, the anniversary of Greek independence, have described this as the book as an opportunity to tell modern Greek history in an exciting multi-season, cable television drama. I don't know. Part of my problem in this is that I negotiated my book contract without an agent. And with you all in Los Angeles and elsewhere, I now need to find someone who's skilled in Hollywood to represent me and turn the Greek connection into a cinematic reality. So if anybody has recommendations, I'd be eager to get your recommendations to help.
Thank you,
there are other parts of your question, so I'm not sure if I answered all the parts you were asking.
Yes, I believe you did. I was just wondering if you saw any different points of emphasis for the different audiences that this book had, whether Greeks in Greece paid emphasis to different parts, whether Greek Americans here they focus more on the American aspect of the book. I was wondering if you saw any interesting differences.
Oh, there clearly were. I mean, the book itself was supposed to have been just a narrow, small book on Watergate in the 1968 effort to expose that blockbuster financial transfer. And clearly it has an appeal for Watergate aficionados and those who are interested in that part. But as I dug deeper and it became a larger book, the book became a book that dealt with modern Greek history in a way that many other books haven't dealt with modern Greek history. And I found interesting reactions from a number of Greek book critics and others who've enjoyed the book for dealing with a part of history that has not been dealt with as often or as effectively, especially by a non-Greek author. And whether you agree or disagree with some of what I have, it's invited some lively discussions, and some of the reviews that are on the book's website have some of the Greek reviews of the book. And I'm hoping that not just with this book, but that I'm pleased to say that Yannis Levintis, who is the CEO of Kaktos, that they have agreed to do a Greek edition of this that will be coming out sometime next year.
That's wonderful news, and congratulations. Congratulations. It's a major publisher, and I'm sure it will have a wide readership in Greece. James, can I ask, Elias Demetracopoulos seemed to have led such an active life in the States. And I was wondering, since we are hosting this from the West Coast, if there is a California connection in the Elias Demetracopoulos story.
Yes, there are many. Beginning in 1964, when Governor Brown and his wife were in Greece at the time that the Watts riots broke out. And they were getting ready to go from Athens to Crete. And Elias was asked by Governor Brown if he could get him on a plane, and the planes were all full, and Elias managed to get Governor Brown and his wife on the first plane, even though it had been overbooked, to go back to Los Angeles to deal with the Watts riots. And Governor Brown plays an important role in several of the book's episodes, including Governor Brown was the one in 1968 who met with him and recommended that he go to Larry O'Brien with his information. There also were other Los Angeles friends who played different roles in helping him during his time of his escape and helping him while he was dealing with the junta. And in fact, one time his friends did a black tie party for him in Los Angeles. And among the guests, Elias was the guest of honor, and among the guests were Ed Sullivan and Dinah Shore. Also some of his Los Angeles friends were those who were warning him about Pierre Salinger and others who were trying to destroy his reputation. And that was after Pierre Salinger was the brief California senator. And finally, in 1971, Elias had arranged to do a nationally televised debate on the issue of providing military aid to Greece. This was the old program called The Advocates, which Governor Dukakis was associated with a number of years. And that program was co-produced by KCET in Los Angeles.
If I may add a question, Simos. It relates to the unfolding of Watergate in particular and what Elias Demetracopoulos' implication was. So why do you say that it was apparent to Kissinger and others in the Nixon administration that it was known that there were plots to kidnap and kill him, but they looked the other way?
All right, if you remember the slide that was on the screen that talked about Elias's death in an Athens prison, the body to that file has never been disclosed, and the repeated efforts to get Kissinger to disclose the information, and he never has. State Department correspondence that I saw at the time of Elias's father's death warned that they should give no one should make any statement that gives any assurance that Elias, if he went to his father's funeral, could return safely. Les Whitten, who was one of Jack Anderson's partners in writing his column over a period of years, he told me about this was some of the information that he received, and he gave me some of his notes from that time, and that was confirmed also. And I have documents describing plots to have him being taken back to Greece by submarine and by airplane. And I have sworn affidavits, some of these are cited and discussed in the book, from Greek diplomats describing the awareness of Kissinger and others as to what was happening. All of that is in the book, and it goes beyond Nixon, because I also have a transcript of an Oval Office meeting when Gerald Ford was president, so on Cyprus, when Kissinger talked about Greek interest in getting rid of Elias.
I mean, there's so much to discover about things that happened half a century ago at this point. And to follow up to that, why didn't Larry O'Brien use the information Elias gave him about Tom Papas and the Greek money?
Well, I explore several theories in the book, and the strongest one that I believe is that O'Brien trusted the message, but not the messenger. If you remember, Elias had been a scoop-hungry reporter whose exposés had angered American officials, and the CIA and other intelligence agencies had tried hard to destroy his reputation and effectiveness. And Pierre Salinger was especially vulnerable to conspiracy theories. If you want to Google Pierre Salinger syndrome sometime, and it will show that it means someone who is tremendously susceptible to believing whatever he sees on the internet is true. And it wasn't the internet at that time, but Salinger in the early stages of the Kennedy administration was kept out of the Bay of Pigs and other activities, and he was fascinated by conspiratorial stories. So he was particularly interested in the conspiratorial stories about Elias. And he was one, I think, who had a great influence on Larry O'Brien in telling him, don't trust Elias, don't trust what he's saying. And I mean, he basically believed that Elias was an untrustworthy communist who worked for the other side. And I talked to Joe Napolitan, who had been O'Brien's media person at the time in 1968. And he said he begged to use the Pappas illegal foreign money material, but O'Brien said absolutely not. I mean, Elias had given O'Brien three options. And he said one was for him to go to Johnson and have Johnson go to Richard Helms, head of the CIA, and have him confirm it and leak the story. Elias said he would set up activities in Greece, meeting with his sources, so that people could meet and have the disclosures done that way. And Elias also offered to pay to bring some of his sources from Keep and elsewhere to the United States to give testimony. And O'Brien said no. And there were stories that in some of the books that have been written about this, that talking about O'Brien going to Johnson or O'Brien going to Humphrey, and they're stopping it, and the reasons why Johnson said no. In my research, I discovered, and it seems pretty clear, that neither Humphrey nor Johnson knew about this at the time. The information stopped with Larry O'Brien.
Thank you. Simos, you had a question from the audience, I believe?
Yes, I'm receiving some questions in private and chat messages. James, can you first tell us where is Elias Demetracopoulos buried? Is he buried in the States or is he buried in Greece? And then we have a question from Sharon Gerstel, our director. Could you talk a bit about his relation with Spiro Agnew?
All right. First of all, Elias was buried in Greece, but he wasn't buried in Greece. He had given explicit instructions that he wanted to be cremated. And I remember talking to him when he was in hospice care in Washington about the possibility of maybe the ashes being sprinkled in the Acropolis, where his father, as an Acropolis guide, had taken him as a young boy. And he smiled at that story. But when people wanted, after his death, to do that, it was forbidden to do that. But what was worked out among his friends in Athens was to take the urn and Kostas Loukopoulos and Persa Metaxas and Christina Moustaklis and a small group took his urn to the Pnyx, is the birthplace of Greek democracy. And they found a place where 90-some-odd-year-old Persa Metaxas didn't have to walk too far up, and they sprinkle his ashes there. So that is where Elias now rests. As far as Spiro Agnew, he had an interesting relationship with Agnew. Agnew was a popular city councilor running for governor in Maryland in 1966, at a time when Elias was taken by Louise Gore, who was his landlady at the Fairfax Hotel, who was a powerhouse in Republican politics, took him to meet Agnew. And they had pleasant conversations at the time, and he liked the idea of Agnew doing well and hoped that he won, and was pleased when he won as governor. But when he ran, Elias told me that he heard some of the stories about Agnew's corruption, But to him, given what he knew about Greek corruption and corruption elsewhere in contracts, he said that was his focus. And he be very upset with Agnew after Agnew had promised him on several occasions to be neutral. And then when he made the switch, I mean, Elias felt that Agnew was what he called a crypto Greek, that he discovered as Greek ethnicity at election time, but really wasn't a Greek or a Greek American the way he thought someone should be. I mean, Agnew didn't speak Greek. He was an Episcopalian. He was married to a non-Greek. He refused to give his children Greek names. He wanted to be called Ted and not Spiro. And he only had a rudimentary knowledge of Greek history, culture, and politics. But it was Agnew's relationship to the Greek junta that upset Elias the most.
Thank you, James. Pick up a question from the chat.
Yes, we do. We have a question from Kathy Paras, who asks, what advice do you think Elias Demetracopoulos would have for investigative journalists of our time? Or what lessons from his life might today's journalists draw from his life? And by extension, I guess we can extend that question to you as well as an investigative journalist, Mr. Barron. And the second part is, do you have any knowledge of what he thought, this is Mr. Demetracopoulos, of our present landscape of journalism and how the media influences politics?
Wow, a whole discussion just on that.
Yes.
Elias, how best to, I think a couple of things. The takeaway from Elias's life is that he stood on the right side of history by standing on the wrong side of dictators and abusive governments. And the message is that to be a whistleblower requires the courage, as I said before, to jeopardize your career, your family safety, and even risk your life. And I'm trying to deal with all your different parts of your questions. Could you ask me one at a time and let me answer them?
Yes, of course. So the first part would be, what advice would Elias Demetracopoulos have to journalists today, or what lessons rather could one draw from his life? Be
stubborn, even at the risk of being outrageous. Be persistent. Be at airports at 4 o'clock in the morning where you meet people. Don't sit at your desk. Go out, knock on doors, and also honor your sources. Keep the confidentiality you have. And one of the remarkable things is that Elias was able to keep a network of sources that ran the political spectrum, that trusted him, that knew whatever they told him, that he would keep and not whisper to somebody else.
Yes, I think the most part that could be life advice for everyone, right? Be persistent, almost outrageous. So do you have any knowledge of what he thought of our present landscape of journalism and how the media influences politics?
I don't know. I mean, because Elias himself basically made a change. He was a journalist and had the sensibility of a journalist all of his life. But when he came to the United States in '67, he couldn't work for his Greek newspapers, and he became an activist. And I think he played a blended role where he fuzzed the line to many journalists today of his relationship with George Papandreou, his relationship with others, that he wasn't. I think there was a Washington Post review of the book that criticized him for blurring the line, and I think that he did in parts, and so that I don't know to what extent he would commend his way of doing it to all journalists. I know there are other journalists who have other approaches today that do not do what Elias did.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we also have a question from Dr. Demetracopoulos, a board member of the American Hellenic Council, who says that Elias's life is fascinating. It's particularly interesting that during the German occupation, he fought against the Germans and sentenced to death at the age of 14. Did you get these stories about his early years directly from Elias or from secondary sources?
I got the stories from Elias, and I got them from some of his childhood friends. And I got the stories from people who helped me get material from the Hellenic Red Cross with information regarding his incarceration and his movement to the mental hospital.
Excellent. So why did you decide to write this book in the first place? What's the backstory?
Serendipity. This book really began in an emergency room in a Boston hospital where I'd been rushed by ambulance in 2007. It's really strange, but as the nurses and doctors were trying to control my symptoms, I was sure, this is my end, this is my death. And to quell my fear, I shut my eyes and I sought to find a place of calm, far from the commotion around me. So I ended up picturing myself on an idyllic summer morning in 1966 on the island of Mykonos, eating succulent figs, freshly baked bread with honey, listening to the sound of donkey bells, of the donkeys ambling down the hillside, and feeling the warmth of the warm, glorious Greek sun on my back. The ER stabilized me, and they discharged me after discovering it was just a terrible reaction to some medication. But for months afterwards, I tried to understand why at that perilous time in my life did my mind take me there? Of all the places in the world I've traveled to, why Mykonos, why Greece? I'd fallen in love with Greece that summer and lived with a local family, and I met people who introduced me to the complexity of Greek politics. So for a while afterwards, when I wasn't working, I toyed at writing a novel set in Greece, and I started to do background research. My brother, who's a successful writer and producer in Hollywood and with the BBC, encouraged me to learn plot development by reading mysteries set in foreign locations, and I did. I even tracked down a girlfriend from that time who's now a psychotherapist in Geneva. And she was game to help me try to fictionalize our experiences, including stories about Tom Pappas, for whom her father worked at the time. But it didn't take me long to realize that I write nonfiction. I write law review articles, I write magazine articles, newspaper articles. I don't write short stories or fiction books. And so I set about doing a serious article on Tom Pappas. And then, as I mentioned in the lecture, in 2009, when I sat at dinner with Cy Hirsch and told him about doing the article on Pappas, and he recommended that I change my focus to Elias. When I went to meet Elias, I realized that Hirsch was right. And that became the beginning of the biography.
Excellent, thank you. Simos, I think you have a question?
Yes, we have an anonymous question from the audience that is asking whether Elias had any involvement in promoting the Greek perspective on the Cyprus issue, especially in 1974 and afterwards.
He did indeed. He had a long history Elias had with Archbishop Makarios that readers can go into in the book from the time that Elias was the first reporter to interview Makarios after he was released from the Seychelles. And so Elias was very concerned about what was happening in Cyprus. And he had an interesting meeting with William Fulbright, who was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in Fulbright's private office when things started to get very serious on Cyprus. And he turned to Fulbright and suggested that Fulbright ask Kissinger, ask the president to have a visit of the Sixth Fleet to interpose itself between Turkey and Cyprus to block any possible Turkish invasion. And Fulbright thought it was a reasonable suggestion, and he called Kissinger, and Kissinger said no. And afterwards, after the Turkish invasion, Elias flew to Geneva and worked with George Mavros. He was handling the press activities for George Mavros during the negotiations. And there's more in the book. There's a whole chapter dealing with Cyprus in the book.
Thank you very much, James. I believe these are all the questions we received and we have for today. So if there are no other questions from the audience, we can move on to thank James for this wonderful presentation, for having written this fascinating book, which I encourage you all to read. I would like to thank Christiana Konto and the American Hellenic Council for collaborating in this event. I would like to thank Governor Michael Dukakis for offering his opening remarks. I would like to thank the Consul General of Greece in Los Angeles, Evgenia Beniatoglou, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you in our future events. James, I don't know if you have any closing comments to offer.
Nothing other than to say, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ to all of you.
Ευχαριστούμε.